As noted earlier, many of the patristic witnesses seem to indicate that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew. A long-standing objection to this is that the canonical Gospel of Matthew could not have originally been translated from Hebrew. Now, first and foremost, it should be pointed out that one need not say that canonical Matthew is a word-for-word translation of a Hebrew original. After all, an early Hebrew Gospel could have very easily been expanded upon and improved in a later Greek edition. So the proponent of a Hebrew Matthew is not committed to believing that our canonical Matthew is an exact translation of a Hebrew Gospel. But with that being said, how strong is the case against believing that canonical Matthew could not have been translated from a Hebrew original, as Papias possibly indicates when he says that everyone translated or interpreted them as he was able? The arguments against this are less than conclusive. Let us consider some of the arguments of J.R.C. Cousland. Cousland argues that, despite scholarly efforts to detect an underlying Aramaic original for Mark or Matthew, it is probable that all the evangelists wrote in the common Greek of their day. Further, the vast majority of Hebrew Bible citations in the New Testament are taken from the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint. Cousland first states that it is probable that Matthew originally wrote in Greek, but he does not supply any supporting evidence which would render this conclusion probable. He also notes that most of the citations from the Old Testament in Matthew are from the Greek Septuagint. I take his implication to be that this somehow makes it unlikely that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew, since it would be inconsistent for a Hebrew work to cite a Greek translation of Scripture. If this is indeed Cousland's intended point, then it seems relatively easy to circumvent it. On the assumption that Matthew originally was a Hebrew work, then it is reasonable to assume that the Old Testament citations were originally from the Hebrew Masoretic text. When the hypothetical translation was taking place, it clearly would have been more efficient for the translator to simply adopt the Septuagint translation of Matthew's Old Testament references rather than attempting to translate these verses into Greek himself. After all, why bother translating these verses into Greek if that has already been done? Another skeptic of a Hebrew Matthew is Dale Martin. He argues, Papias, for example, also thought that the Gospel of Matthew had originally been written in Hebrew and only later had been translated into Greek. That is wrong. It is clear to modern scholars that Matthew is written in Greek. It shows no signs of being a translation from Hebrew, and in some instances, it makes a point by using Greek words that cannot have been translations from Hebrew. Martin's only argument that it is impossible for Matthew to have been translated from Hebrew to Greek is that Matthew's Gospel contains Greek words which don't have Hebrew equivalents. Unfortunately, he supplies no examples of this, so it's difficult to know exactly how to respond to Martin. Suffice to say that translation is rarely ever a direct word-for-word copying from one language into another, precisely because some words don't have exact equivalents in the other language, and because things like figures of speech don't always carry over into another language. Even if Matthew's Gospel contains Greek words which don't have exact Hebrew equivalents, it is very dubious to think that whatever is expressed in Greek in Matthew's Gospel could not have been expressed in Hebrew at all. It is often objected that we have no surviving manuscript evidence for a Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, but this objection fails to consider that the vast majority of works written in the ancient past have not survived until the present. Given that a gospel written in Hebrew would not have been as widely used as a Greek gospel, it is not surprising that a Hebrew gospel would not have survived until the present day. Moreover, it is perfectly legitimate to postulate the existence of documents which are no longer extant when there is strong evidence that they once existed. This is exactly what the hypothetical Q source is supposed to be. If there is nothing illegitimate about postulating Q in the absence of any textual evidence for this document, as the majority of scholars do, then there cannot be anything wrong with postulating a Hebrew Matthew in the absence of any textual evidence for this document. Indeed, if we are reading Papias and Irenaeus correctly, the hypothesis that there was a Hebrew Matthew at least has testimonial evidence in its favor. The same cannot be said for the Q document, unless of course one wants to suppose that these are one and the same. Beyond this, we know that plenty of documents which were originally written in Hebrew were later translated into Greek around this time. As Sang-Bok Kim argues, There are similar instances in the history of literature which might add credence to the possibility of such translation. In the 3rd century BC, the entire Old Testament was reproduced in Greek. 1st Maccabees was first written in Hebrew, but the original Hebrew text was lost at a very early date. There is no evidence of its use by any early writer. The earliest version is preserved only in Greek. Furthermore, it was already noted that Josephus composed the Wars of the Jews in Hebrew at first, but reproduced it in a Greek edition, and today there is no trace of the original text. With all that being said, it is also possible that we have misunderstood Papias this entire time. There is another possible interpretation of what he said with respect to Matthew's Gospel. While most translations of Papias render him as saying that Matthew wrote in the Hebrew language, the word he uses is dialecto, and it can also be legitimately translated as style or dialect. As Bernard Orchard explains, in the 1st century, dialecto commonly meant both language and style, so that our phrase could mean either in a Jewish language or in a Jewish style, depending on the context. Under this interpretation, Papias would be saying that Matthew wrote his Gospel not in the Hebrew language, but in a Hebrew style. It is certainly not controversial that Matthew's Gospel is the most Jewish of the Synoptics in terms of familiarity with Jewish customs and messianic emphasis. Robert Gundry argues that the context of Papias' quotation of the elder John favors this understanding. In his statement quoted by Papias, the elder shows concern over Mark's style, particularly over the disorderly way the single points concerning Jesus' ministry appear in the Gospel of Mark. This concern favors a similar frame of reference in the statement about Matthew, whose writing, by contrast, exhibits orderliness. This contrast comes out clearly in the elder's parallelistic use of the verb arranged to describe what Matthew did do with the Lord's oracles, and of the cognate noun arrangement to describe what Mark, following Peter, did not do with the Lord's oracles. Furthermore, the elder says nothing at all about the linguistic form of Mark, which he ought to mention if it is his intention to introduce, by way of contrast, a different linguistic form in Matthew. Apparently, Matthew does not have a linguistic form different from Mark's Greek. A Hebrew dialect, then, does not imply that Matthew wrote in the Aramaic language. Gundry's argument is strong, but there is still the difficulty of Papias going on to say that everyone translated or interpreted Matthew's writings as best they could, which indicates some sort of language barrier. As Jeremiah Tritle points out, it is thus plausible that Papias believed that Matthew wrote in the Hebrew language, given that others had to translate it as they were able. It is, therefore, impossible to definitively say one way or the other whether or not the earliest patristic witnesses testify to a Hebrew Gospel of Matthew or not. But what is very clear is that they all agree that Matthew, in some form or another, was written first,